So my grandmother, as I said, that's what she's most known for, Henrietta Seiberling, but in fact, she would say that's the least of her contributions. And one of the most important contributions she made to Alcoholics Anonymous was the anonymity part, okay? So the reason in the groups they don't use names is because of her. And the reason the Alcoholics Anonymous book it's not by Bill Wilson, and all the names in it are not said. No one's name's given, except for Dr. Silkworth. His name's given because he's not an alcoholic. So in about 1937, after that call, and there was two groups going on. There was one in New York and there was one in Akron. And the New York group and Akron combined had about 40 members. Now there's about 1.6 million groups worldwide, or rather in the US. Worldwide there's many, many more. And many of you are among them. And she would be honored to know that you're following the mystery that is keeping you sober. And she'd be honored to know that she could be a part of that. Now, here's how the anonymity came from the personal group standpoint. So my grandmother was in the Oxford group, and there was a lot of big names in the Oxford group. There was the Goodyears were involved, the Firestones were involved, and my grandmother loved the whole Oxford group thing, but she saw as it went along, there was more and more people that were kind of going there for the names, okay? They're going there because they wanted to be seen among these people, and this is particularly poignant with my grandmother's friend, who was Harvey Firestone, because she was living in the Goodyear. She was part of the Goodyear family. She married into it. It's a whole nother story, but she married into it, and Harvey Firestone was a friend of hers, and he was an alcoholic. Now, he quit drinking for bouts, but he could never quite completely stop because AA wasn't developed enough. There wasn't the 12 steps. There wasn't the idea of the anonymity, which is a major part of its strength. And so people would go to these Oxford group meetings, and they'd go and they'd sort of say, oh, I'm here, and Harvey Firestone's here. Bud Firestone, they called him. And there's other big names, maybe like the Astors or other people, the Goodyear, and all these people. And she also noticed that people were sort of vying for spiritual, I'm more spiritual than you thing. All that she knew was horrible, and all that she knew was going to ruin the Oxford group eventually, which it did. The Oxford group eventually, it doesn't exist anymore. It became something else, and it's really essentially nothing right now. But she came away from that group, and people would come to her in tears because these people would say, "Are you maximum?" That was the term they used. Are you maximum? Are you praying 5 times a day? Are you? And she knew that you should never say, "Are you this or are you that?" And so she immediately told her group in her Oxford group in Akron. She said, "You should never say I should or we should," because to her it was God. It was all God does this. It's not anybody. And so she knew right then, seeing these people coming to her in tears after they'd been slighted by these people who were saying, "Are you maximum?" She knew that people have varying degrees of recovery. They have varying degrees of spirituality in their growth. And she knew how important that was. And she knew it should all be supported. No one should be maximum, So, you can be maximum, it's okay. But if you're not, that's okay too. And so she immediately took back to her group, the King School, and she said, we shouldn't be using names. If people come here and they don't want to use their name, they don't need to. They can just come here, and that's the beginning of the anonymous part. Now, in terms of the book, which is also anonymous. Now, Bill Wilson and she were at this point, this is about 1937, actually a little bit later, 1938, 1939. Bill Wilson and Henrietta were very good friends at this point. And she was kind of, she always liked to say, Bill Wilson for leading up to 1935 had been more or less on a binge for decades. And obviously, he couldn't help it, but My grandmother, meanwhile, had been all that time developing her spirituality. She'd been playing piano. She was a singer. She was very religious. Although she wouldn't classify herself as a Bible thumper type of person at all. She was just religious. She didn't even go to church that much, but she would try to communicate with God according to the Oxford group. And so Bill Wilson called her as he was writing the 12 steps. This is probably about 1938, I would say. And let's see. So he called her, and he was writing the 12 steps, and he said, Henrietta, I'm writing this book, and he was very inspired, and it was wonderful. He wrote the 12 steps in one night. Of course, a lot led up to that, but imagine that. He wrote the 12 steps, a draft, of course, but he wrote them. It came to him like a huge inspiration, and he was working on the Alcoholics Anonymous book, and he was very excited, and, I'm the man type of excitement, that's Bill Wilson, right?
Yeah.
And that's why we love him. And without that, we wouldn't have Alcoholics Anonymous, because he really had to have a lot of drive, And so Bill called Henrietta and said, I have this book, and he was kind of like an excited schoolboy, and he said, Henrietta, I have this book, and then she said, oh, well, that sounds very nice, Bill. Sounds like it's going to be a good book. What are you going to call it? And so and I'll just read this part from the biography. When telling the story, she couldn't recall the exact titles he ran by her, god-awful as they were. But he'd managed to get his name into at least one of them. And she told her daughters, which is one of her daughters, my mother. She told her daughters about the titles and everything. And I tried to get my mom many years later to remember what the titles were. And my mother said, oh, I don't know, something like How Bill Wilson Saved the World from Drinking. And there was actually some titles like that. If you do the research, there's some like the BW movement and things like that. It's really kind of funny. But obviously Bill, comes down to earth as he always does, or rather rises up to heaven, the spiritual realm as he always does. And then she said, oh, okay, Bill. Well, I'm not sure about those titles, but you'll think of something. And he said, well, yeah. And then he said, well, who's? And then he said, and of course he told her, and of course I'm going to sign it as the author, by Bill Wilson. And she said, oh no, Bill, nobody signs it. It will have to be entirely anonymous. It's a book created by all of you. And it must inspire complete humility among its readers. The book actually is composed by many, many people. And it's important to remember also, and one thing she also said is, it is only when we ask nothing of ourselves that we are most rewarded. Now remember, she wanted Bill to be his best self. Okay, she wasn't trying to bring Bill down a peg. She really wanted him to be his best self, his best, what she called his best stature as a man. And she knew that in order to do that, he would have to be a selfless person. So she wanted him to be a selfless self. And that was her goal. She was trying to bring Bill up to the best he could be. Now, it's very important to remember, all this anonymity has nothing to do with hiding. And to her it didn't. It has nothing to do with hiding, out of shame or fear of reprisal. In fact, the opposite. She thought that people should trumpet their membership to Alcoholics Anonymous. Because the more people that know about an alcoholic's affliction, the more likely they are to keep sober. Makes sense, right? And if you're in a business or something where they look down on you, and this isn't so much the case now, but I mean, a little bit, but back in the 30s or the 40s, I mean, come on. If they find out, someone might fire you. But she thought, well, then maybe it's time to find another line of business because you're doing the right thing. And your business should always respect that you're doing the right thing. And she's considered it a moral issue, as it really is. And no one really knows who came up with this beautiful phrase, Alcoholics Anonymous. But we know it came from the aggregate of anonymity of the meeting goers, the authors, the movement leaders, all their anonymousness. But she gave them their namelessness. And it's fitting that this history about the anonymous aspect of the group and the book was not really known until now. And that's because Henrietta wasn't one to yak about her role. She kept anonymous herself by intent. And she was mentioned in various articles and stuff, and she was invited to the various big meetings in the 50s and whatnot. And of course she was dear friends with Bill Wilson until he died. But her friends respected that reticence, and Alcoholics Anonymous carries her spirit throughout the world. The title says who she was by hiding who. And I'd just like to close with one little poem by Samuel Menashe called Anonymous. Truth to tell, seldom told under oath. We live lies and grow old, self-disguised. Who are you I talk to? Thank you very much.
Oh,